This meeting is called to order. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, it is my privilege to welcome you today to this briefing on international legal responsibilities for preventing genocide, holding perpetrators of war crimes accountable, and for ending the unlawful occupation of Palestine. Today's event will consist of a short opening, followed by briefings by two UN Special Rapporteurs on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 and on health, followed by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. We will also hear from representatives of the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights and the NGO Law for Palestine. Please allow me to mention before we begin that, as reminded by the UN Department of Safety and Security, and according to the rules of the Secretariat, no form of protest will be allowed during this meeting. I will now deliver remarks in my capacity as chair of the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, as we gather here today, it is over 1 year since the 7th of October attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups against Israel and the subsequent Gaza war. During that year, we have been bearing witness to one of the most devastating conflicts in our time. This not only has brought immeasurable suffering to Palestinian civilians following the 7 October attack. So far, the conflict has highlighted the multilateral system's inability to bring an end to this heart-wrenching tragedy. Our committee, the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, mandated by the GA to advocate for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, has organized today's event. As indicated, the UN Special Rapporteurs on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 and on health, and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory are here to brief the committee. The UN experts have and continue to do heroic work in investigating and documenting what has been happening on the ground throughout the OPT, sifting through vast amounts of documents and testimonies to gather evidence, passing facts from allegation, truth from misinformation. Your efforts are vital, not only for telling the story of Gaza, but more importantly, for ensuring accountability. After more than a year of devastating conflict, it is difficult to find proper words to describe the Israeli-made catastrophe unfolding in Gaza and the West Bank. Instead, let me share key excerpts from recent reports and statements by the UN experts, whose strong language underscores the grave severity of the Gaza crisis. In the joint statement of all special rapporteurs on 11th October, they describe Gaza, let me quote, "The Strip is now a wasteland of rubble and human remains." Another sentence, "Israeli bombs have spared no one." Another one, "Constant bombing has turned humanitarian zones into killing fields," unquote. Similarly, the Commission of Inquiry, in its report published on the 10th of October, stated that, I quote, Israel has perpetrated a concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system as part of a broader assault on Gaza. Another sentence, Israeli security forces have deliberately killed, detained, and tortured medical personnel and targeted medical vehicles while tightening the siege on Gaza and restricting permits to leave the territory for medical treatment, unquote. These UN experts' reports and statements are balanced, addressing the atrocities and crimes against humanity by both Israeli security forces and Palestinian militants. Their analysis counters frequent accusations by those not in favor of the UN's work and efforts in the OPT, who claim that UN experts, including UN Special Rapporteurs, the COI, and other UN officials, are biased towards one side, a criticism recently even directed at the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. For example, while the COI has reported on the 11th of September of this year, serious violations by Israeli security forces against Palestinian detainees, as was widely reported in the media, it also writes, quote, regarding the Israeli and foreign hostages held in Gaza by Palestinian armed groups, the report found that many were mistreated to inflict physical pain and severe mental suffering, including physical violence, abuse, sexual violence, forced isolation, limited access to hygiene facilities, water and food, threats, and humiliation. The committee firmly supports accountability for all individuals and parties responsible for crimes against humanity and ensuring all victims are recognized. Violations of international human rights law must be condemned regardless of who commits those breaches. Ladies and gentlemen, the Palestinian struggle and the current situation in Gaza highlight a stark power imbalance between Israel occupying power and the occupied Palestinian people. We are witnessing relentless Israeli military strikes by air, land, and sea against a defenseless Palestinian population, men, women, children, and the elderly, all attacked in a disproportionate and undeniable assault to their rights and to their security. To date, over 43,000 Palestinians have been killed, more than 100,000 injured, and many remain buried under the rubble in Gaza, with the entire population enduring extreme suffering. As we enter the second year of this conflict with no end in sight, Israel has also intensified attacks and discriminatory policies in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, bolstered by state-supported settler violence. And the escalating conflict in the OPT now risks igniting a broader regional war. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, the sad truth is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not an intractable question. To the contrary, we all know the solution, and for a long time. The conflict will only end with two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and within secure borders. This is the way, this is the future, and after the current war, the parties have to be brought back to the table to find a mechanism to get there. But for now, the pressing tasks are these. First, there has to be an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining Israeli captives in Gaza and Palestinian detainees in Israel, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Second, GA Resolution ES-10/24, calling on UN member states to comply with the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on Israel's policies and practices in the OPT, has to be fully implemented. Third, member states of the United Nations must safeguard the international system of rules-based multilateralism. We need to do so for the sake of the people in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and in the whole region. Allowing a continuation of the Gaza war, a continuation of the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, a continuation of the killing of innocent Palestinian lives, a continuation of an apparent impunity in the face of documented violations of fundamental norms and laws will make the restoration of peace increasingly difficult to achieve. Our committee will continue to be engaged with other member states and regional organizations, with UN bodies and other partners to help bring an end to the current war and avert regional conflagration. I thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to request the representative of the State of Palestine, Ambassador Feda Abdelhady, to deliver her remarks. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are grateful to the committee for its tireless efforts in solidarity with the Palestinian people and for gathering us today at a time of paramount urgency for collective action to uphold our legal, political, humanitarian, and moral obligations to prevent genocide, to ensure accountability and justice, and to finally bring an end to Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. I wish to join you in welcoming our esteemed briefers, UN Special Rapporteurs, Ms. Francesca Albanese and Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, Honorable Commissioner Chris Sidoti. We look forward to your presentations of your powerful reports alongside numerous joint statements that you have issued as Special Rapporteurs concerning all of aspects of the grave human rights situation of the Palestinian people under Israel's illegal occupation. I also wish to welcome Ms. Diana Buttu from the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights and Ms. Anisha Patel from Law for Palestine, and stress civil society's crucial role in our joint pursuit of justice. Mr. Chair, we have said it continually, the Nakba against the Palestinian people never ended, no chapter darker than that which our people in Gaza have suffered for the past year. The absence of accountability has permitted Israel's unbridled impunity, its politicians, military, and settler militias descending to unimaginable depths of cruelty and depravity, inflicting unfathomable terror, trauma, loss, and devastation on the Palestinian people, a situation equated to, quote, hell on earth, a betrayal of our humanity, a stain on the world's conscience. Tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians, babies, children, women, men, youth, elderly, have been killed. 902 families exterminated in their entirety. Thousands more civilians are unaccounted for, crushed to death under rubble, bodies shredded or burned beyond recognition, or buried in mass graves. Over 100,000 people injured and maimed, thousands abducted, imprisoned in Israeli torture camps, many killed in captivity. 2 million people forcibly displaced over and over again, hunted down by Israel's occupation forces from one corner of Gaza to the other, where over 80% of civilian infrastructure has been decimated and nowhere is safe. Today, north of Gaza is the epicenter of Israel's genocidal onslaught. Those not killed by Israel's weapons are being starved to death and ravaged by disease as the occupying power continues its siege of Gaza, obstructing aid and depriving our people of food, water, medicine, and all essentials for human survival, targeting hospitals and aid workers, deliberately imposing conditions of life intended to collectively punish, to torment, to force departure, to destroy our people, forcing them to choose between ethnic cleansing, genocide, or surrender and submission to its settler colonial domination and apartheid regime. And yet, still, no accountability, no protection for the occupied, defenseless civilian population targeted by this genocidal wrath. Instead, there is rampant impunity, more atrocities, more colonization, more annexation, more persecution in Gaza and across the rest of occupied Palestine, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Instead, war criminals are perennially shielded from accountability by the U.S. veto in the Security Council, by an inability or unwillingness to implement resolutions even when adopted, by a failure to uphold legal responsibilities and impose consequences in the face of flagrant violations and grave breaches of international law. It is the height of perversity, even as Israel violates every rule of law, every moral principle, every tenet of humanity, instead of being held responsible, instead of independent international investigations, accountability, and consequences, Israel is actually the one taking punitive measures. The case of UNRWA is the most recent glaring example of this. Israel attacks UNRWA facilities, targets and destroys shelter for the displaced, killing and injuring thousands, murders UNRWA staff, obstructs its humanitarian mission, smears and libels the agency, and passes so-called legislation to outlaw it. Yet perversely, Israel claims it is the one under attack by the UN, even as it is the one waging an open war on the UN, not just on UNRWA, but on the Secretary General, on Special Rapporteurs and Commissioners, on the Security Council, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, the ICJ, the ICC, on this committee, on every single country that dares to speak out, on the entire UN system and the international community it represents. It is a methodical, unprecedented, all-out attack in violation of the UN Charter, international law, and UN resolutions, and begging the question of how Israel remains a member of this organization. Instead of international law being upheld, as High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk has warned, the international rule of law is being progressively dismantled. But what we see in your work, Special Rapporteurs and Commissioners, and civil society, are powerful testimonies to the facts and clarion calls for justice. We see that there are many who refuse to allow this dismantlement of international law, to allow the perversion of the law and perversion of the truth. We see those who will act with courage and principle to safeguard international law and insist on its respect, to uphold human rights universally and demand justice. We have tools afforded to us by international law to end this impunity and must use them as a matter of urgency. This has been the state of Palestine's abiding call for accountability for all the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide committed against the Palestinian people, and we remain unwavering in our commitment to realize justice for them. With the recent advisory opinion by the ICJ on the illegality of the Israeli occupation and the General Assembly resolution that followed, clearly affirming the obligations of all states to bring an end to this abhorrent situation, including by means of a halt to arms transfers, ending all dealings with settlements, and other measures of accountability. with the ICJ provisional measures orders in the case initiated by South Africa under the Genocide Convention, and with the mounting global awareness, protests, and demands for a ceasefire, for an end to the genocide, for an end to Israel's occupation, and for a free Palestine, we believe we are at a turning point. Although the days have never been darker, the prospects for justice and accountability have never been greater. The responsibilities of the international community are no longer up for debate. They are explicit and urgent. We must stop this genocide, hold perpetrators of war crimes accountable, and end this illegal, immoral, and inhumane occupation, which stands in defiance of every legal and moral principle. We owe it to the Palestinian people and to future generations in our region and around the world to preserve and uphold the rule of law and to move beyond words and pursue justice with conviction. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ambassador Feda Abdelhady Nasser, I thank you for your statement. I thank you for the strong message you have delivered, the passion, and also for being an inspiration to all of us. We renew our solidarity to your people and to your authorities in these very difficult times. I will now give the floor to each of our panelists for short briefings on their respective topics and areas. After these interventions, I will open the floor for questions, starting with committee members and observers, and then to everyone else. In the interest of time and to allow for rich discussion, we invite all those representatives of member states and intergovernmental organizations who prepared statements to send these documents to the Division for Palestinian Rights of the United Nations Secretariat. They will then be posted on the committee website. Please be reminded that simultaneous interpretation is provided in 6 languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish, to accommodate all interventions of our panelists as well as our diverse, esteemed audience. There is no exception because of the technical constraints. The expert speaker from the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights, Mrs. Diana Buttu, will join us via video call and will speak in English, but her remarks would not be interpreted. However, the whole event will still be webcast live on UN Web TV. I also want to inform that to reduce the usage of paper, documents related to this panel discussion and the committee have been put in a virtual folder, and you can access it by scanning the QR code near the 2 entrances into your smartphones. All participants are also encouraged to disseminate information about the panel discussion on their social media and use the hashtag #RightsForPalestine. Let us now start with our first panelist, Mrs. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian Territory Occupied since 1967. Ms. Albanese, you have a very long resume, but I'll just say here that you are an affiliate scholar at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University, and you have published widely on the legal situation in Israel and Palestine, and you are also a longtime counterpart and partner of our committee. Mrs. Albanese, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Ambassador Abdelhady, and colleagues from the Commission of Inquiry and the Special Rapporteurship. I would like to start by reading the remarks I started with yesterday as I presented my 5th report as a Special Rapporteur to the 3rd Committee of the General Assembly. In a year in which I was turned into a reluctant chronicler of genocide, I feel compelled to start by paying my respects to the victims and survivors of all genocides, past and present, including the Native Americans, like the Lenape people, who are the original stewards of the land on which this institution stands. Certainly, the ongoing struggle of Native Americans and indigenous peoples everywhere to regain and maintain their rights on their ancestral land, like the Palestinians, would be less challenging if institutions like this one, premised upon equality and freedom of all and self-determination for all, were actually committed to addressing and unraveling the colonial past, beginning by confronting the prevailing colonial amnesia that affects many of them. And as Italian Holocaust survivor Primo Levi reminds us, it is the amnesia of the past and the erasure of its victims that allows history to repeat itself. And why did I start by reading this again and again? It's because history is repeating itself. Yesterday, I presented my second report on genocide. Why so? Why do I insist in calling it genocide? Because it's so difficult to prove intent. Why don't you go with war crimes and crimes against humanity? Because it's genocide. Because if you go to a doctor and you have cancer and you are diagnosed with fever, you have a problem, a big problem, and it's the same with the people who's being genocided. Because it's not about a collection of war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Palestinians are experiencing. They have experienced through their entire life as a people war crimes and crimes against humanity. But nowadays, the situation is different. And it's very important that we understand what is genocide and why this is to be recognized as a genocide. Because in the same way as the international community has failed to protect the victims of genocide in the case of the Jewish people in Europe, and then the Bosnians in former Yugoslavia, and then the Tutsi in Rwanda. In the same way, we are failing the Palestinians. And I want to express all my respect and solidarity with the Palestinian people, because it's a torment to be here as a Palestinian and having to tell all of us about the genocide that their people are experiencing. Because a people is like a body. You chop one arm, you chop one limb, the entire body suffers. And this is what a people is. It's something organic. And the same thing is the relation between the people and the land. For indigenous people, the land is not the place where they live. The land is who they are. And this is why we need to understand the bigger design behind what's happening in Palestine today. On the 14th of October, when together with other special rapporteurs, we started to denounce, to raise the alarm that what Israel had started to do might be genocide, and there was a serious risk of genocide. And then as of November, 30 of us have said a genocide is unfolding. I also said on the 14th of October, under the fog of war, Israel accelerates the forced displacement of the Palestinians. And I do say that out of the scholarship that I've produced, because the way I know the question of Palestine is through the forced displacement of its people, since even before the State of Israel was created. Palestinians have been kicked out of their land amid the destruction of their villages and everything they had from 1947-49 and in 1967, and it continues. And what's happening today, it's much more severe because of the technology, because of the weaponry, but also because of the impunity that has been granted to the State of Israel over 76 years. The hubris that has led Israel to attack not just the Palestinian people or the Lebanese, and to the Lebanese also goes my solidarity in this moment, but the United Nations. This year has also marked an attack against the United Nations physically, symbolically. In terms of functions, Israel has damaged or in any way bombed and targeted and hit 70% of UNRWA infrastructure in Gaza. It has launched a campaign, a smear campaign against UNRWA, which intensified a pattern that was already established. And it has killed 230 UN staff members, colleagues of many of those who work in this institution. And it has targeted the humanitarian capacity of UNRWA. And it has even targeted UN peacekeepers. And it has targeted the UN Secretary General and independent experts. And its very illustrious assembly. No one has been spared, not just among the Palestinians and the Lebanese, even in the United Nations. And it's because of that, on top of the genocide and on top of the 57 years of unlawful occupation, that I say it's time to consider suspending the credential of Israel as a member state. I understand the sensitivity, because none of you has really clean hands when it comes to human rights. That's okay, but no one else has maintained an unlawful occupation violating decades of UN Security Council, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, International Court of Justice, decision and resolutions, as Israel has done. Enough. And the last point, genocide. While this is genocide is a very insidious crime. It's a process, it's not an act. And there is a significant jurisprudence, but still incipient jurisprudence, thankfully. And the critical element to determine genocide is the intent behind acts of killing and infliction harm and creating conditions of life leading to the destruction of a group as such. There is the intent. And the discussion I hear, including from scholars, well, it's difficult to prove the intent. The intent is not a motive. It's a different thing. Its intent is the determination to destroy through criminal acts. Motives can vary. One can commit genocide because of, or can develop the will, the determination to commit genocide to stay in power, or to liberate the hostages, or to commit other crimes. But the moment there is the determination to destroy, then the intent of genocide is formed, and you don't even need to have genocide unfolding to intervene. We have already failed the Palestinians. Genocide has already been committed. But we need to, first of all, intervene, stop and punish the perpetrators, and then to stop it because it's expanding to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. No Palestinian is safe under Israeli rule. And the other element, and with this I will conclude, what is critical is the responsibility of the state. We cannot apply the same threshold for alleged perpetrators, so criminal responsibility, to a state. Otherwise, if we have to look at the paradox, preventing genocide would be an impossible mission if we have to wait until the guarantees that fair trial afford to alleged perpetrators are satisfied. We would never prevent genocide. But here, the responsibility of a state is evident, especially in a self-proclaimed rule of law system, which has checks and balances. It's not just the executive, it's the parliament and the judiciary. What have these bodies done in Israel to prevent genocide? Nothing. Not only, this is not the result of action of some members of the government. This is a collective responsibility of the state of Israel. And because of that, I say, this is the first settler colonial genocide to be litigated in human history. The cry for justice behind this case will resonate across the globe and will make a difference also for other indigenous people that have never seen a day of justice. Thank you very much.
Special Rapporteur, I thank you for your intervention and for your very important and frank briefing on the situation in the OPT. I will now give the floor to our second briefer, Mrs. Tlaleng Mofokeng, UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, a medical doctor with expertise in advocating for universal health access, HIV care, youth-friendly services, and family planning. Mrs. Mofokeng has been commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality in South Africa, among other duties. Mrs. Mofokeng, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. I welcome this opportunity to speak to you here today in my capacity as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. We have watched the horror of a genocide unfold for over a year now, representing a display of recalcitrant, repugnant attitude of an occupying powers regime and its global allies. This has been an ongoing enactment of decades-long genocidal plans, systemic and sustained imperialist violence experienced by Palestinians every single day since the Nakba. 1 year later, the promise by Israeli leaders to destroy Gaza has been fulfilled. The Strip, now a wasteland of rubble and human remains, where survivors, many of them women, children, people who are disabled, the elderly, struggle to hold on to life amid deprivation and disease. An unknown number of people remain under rubble, bodies decomposing, including in the ruins of what used to be clinics and hospitals. The practice of medicine is under attack by Israel. Just days into this war, I warned that the Gaza's medical infrastructure was on the path of being irreparably damaged. That early warning system was ignored. Healthcare providers were working in a dire situation themselves, already under bombardment in the enclave. At the moment, according to the WHO, only 17 out of 36 hospitals are partially functioning. There have been 516 attacks on health facilities, with 765 people killed in those attacks. We have many people still requiring urgent medical evacuations for uptake and upgrade in care. All hospitals have insufficient and unreliable power. They struggle to save lives amid critical shortages of not just healthcare workers, but also trickling supplies of medical equipment and items that are necessary. Not only is Israel killing and causing irreparable harm against Palestinian people with bombardments, but Israel and their allies are also knowingly and intentionally imposing famine and dehydration. I remain concerned at the ongoing risks of water and airborne diseases, the many complex injuries that are resulting from the kinds of military arsenal that is used, as well as new and developing disabilities and complications created from a lack of timeous intervention for both medical and surgical care. Pregnant women are not receiving adequate nutrition and health care. Children, especially under 5, continue to be at high risk of severe malnutrition, placing a whole generation in danger of suffering from stunting, which causes irreparable physical and cognitive impairment. There are no guarantees regarding consistency of medical supplies with insufficient water, inadequate sanitation, food, medicines. Healthcare facilities, including ambulances, have been critically affected. The protracted violence makes much of the population in need of psychological and mental support and psychological first aid impossible to provide. The ongoing situation is untenable. My mandate has received information regarding arrests, detention of healthcare workers, demonstrating again a pattern, including arrest of medical personnel while they are on duty, medical personnel being forced to evacuate hospitals, and some immediately arrested. Some are dying under these circumstances and reportedly being beaten in prison with their bodies showing signs of torture. Most recently, a colleague of mine, Dr. Ziad Eldadou, was a third doctor confirmed to have died while being detained by Israel. He was an internal medicine physician in Al-Shifa Hospital. He was detained along with other healthcare workers while on duty on 18th March 2024. This was during a raid by Israeli forces, and he was in detention and he reportedly died on the 21st of March 2024. The number of widespread violations of the special protection afforded to civilians and violations related to lack of protection of medical personnel under international human rights law and international human rights law have been immeasurable. The destruction of health systems created by this genocide is incompatible with the realization of the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Israel and its allies have ignored the International Court of Justice, the UN experts, and they continue to commit an immeasurable number of violations against civilians, children, medical personnel. Israel is obligated to protect, promote, and respect human rights of all individuals. I have communicated to the member state Israel in an urgent appeal some of my concerns. The long-term trauma of people in Gaza will carry with them, because of this enduring intergenerational physical and mental health impacts of structural discrimination, of racism and violence. We are yet to fully quantify or even develop a matrix to measure the true impact of this genocide, its compounding nature of what was never a situation that was conducive to the right to health even before October the 7th. All immediate and future interventions aimed at lasting peace must center the restoration of dignity of people of Palestine. An immediate deep analysis and a recovery, a rebuilding and a resourcing of the health system to be able to provide accessible, acceptable, quality care, including expediting of medical evacuations. Reparative justice and as an approach will require a very different kind of solidarity from this room and from this headquarters. And to all of the oppressed people everywhere in the world who are exploited, humiliated, brutalized, and colonized, I fulfill my mandate viscerally aware and understand the compounding, crushing weight of this violence and the issues that you face every day. And I share in the rage and the fury of so many people around the world. I am ashamed and I am deeply sorry that the multilateral world has failed you. And I hope that one day we will share a different collective connection as a humanity that isn't based on experiences of colonial imperialist trauma or what it has taken from us and our people and our collective futures. And I reiterate my call as follows. A genocide is incompatible with the realization of the right of everyone to the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. We need an immediate ceasefire. We need an end to this illegal occupation. We need an end and accountability to this genocide. And that ultimately, colleagues, peace follows liberation. And that you cannot extinguish the human desire for freedom. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur Mofokeng, for sharing with us this extremely concerning update on the health situation faced by the Palestinians today. Our next speaker is Mr. Chris Sidoti, a commissioner in the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. Mr. Sidoti is the founder of the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar and was one of the members of the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar. He has also provided consultancy services on human rights law to OHCHR, UNDP, and UNICEF, among others. Commissioner Sidoti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you and the members of your committee for enabling this meeting to take place today. Yesterday, when we appeared before the third committee, states had 60 seconds to respond to our report. We would have liked to have heard more from you. And I think this gathering today gives us the opportunity of hearing more from you. Feda, when you were speaking, I couldn't help but try to imagine how I would have felt if I had been talking about my country and describing the things that you described. I don't know how you do it. Journalists ask simple questions, and I often get a question from journalists, how would you describe what is happening? And I'm left speechless. And then I use one word, and only one word: overwhelming. And I mean overwhelming in two senses. What is happening to the Palestinian people of Gaza, and to an increasing but lesser extent on the West Bank, is enormous, unprecedented. It is overwhelming them. And it's overwhelming as well for the rest of us. I mean, for us as investigators, but for all of you as diplomats. What I've been impressed with this week, in the days that we've been here and the meetings that we have had, has been the number of times that all of you cold-hearted, hard-shelled diplomats have said to us how overwhelmed and frustrated and sad you are. I have been moved by the fact that so many of you are personally affected about what is happening. And I'll come back to that. I don't want to go through what we found. All of our reports are there. If you want to read them, you can read them. I want to look at the three issues, Ambassador, that you've listed as the themes for this gathering, and not say what we have found, but what we are doing and why. To use this as an opportunity to tell you about the approach that our Commission of Inquiry is taking. One of our terms of reference provides that we look at the underlying root causes of the situation in Palestine and Israel. And for us, that was very much the starting point. We presented our report to the General Assembly, our first report, there's now been 3, in October 2022. And in that report, we described how, for us, the underlying root causes, or at least 2 of them, were occupation and discrimination. We gave our analysis of occupation and formed the view that it was unlawful. That was our conclusion, but we also appreciated that this was a matter of such seriousness that a definitive, authoritative statement of the legality or otherwise of the occupation was required. And so we recommended to you that there be a reference from the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice. And I'll be frank, to my shock, the General Assembly acted on it almost immediately. That reference was made a few weeks after we made the recommendation. The International Court of Justice accepted the analysis that we had undertaken. It did its own analysis, of course, but its reasoning was the same as ours. And as you know, in July, in its opinion, it indicated that the occupation was unlawful. This is certainly one of the root causes and one of the most significant root causes. The court also found that the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination had been historically and continuingly violated as well. And that in fact, the occupation and the violation of the right to self-determination were intrinsically linked. The court ordered that the occupation be ended as rapidly as possible. And we were very pleased when the General Assembly took the first steps on that in the resolution in September. Not the last steps, but the first steps. And it was a very rapid response again from the General Assembly to the court's opinion. So for us, a focus on ending the unlawful occupation of Palestine has been a predominant focus in the work that we have done to date. Linked to that has been the question of accountability. Just as we have this explicit term of reference to deal with underlying root causes, so too we are instructed to deal with the issue of accountability. Of course, we have taken that responsibility very seriously. We cooperate with the courts whenever requested and to the greatest extent possible. Under the general arrangement between the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, we have an arrangement, a protocol with the Office of the Prosecutor in relation to the investigation into the situation of Palestine. We provide information to the prosecutor on a monthly basis, and to date have provided over 10,000 pieces of information to assist the prosecutor's investigations. That's part of our responsibility. We collect the information, we verify it, we form conclusions as to the significance of the information in relation to international crimes, and we provide it to the prosecutor. We can also provide information to parties to international litigation cases. We were requested to provide assistance to the government of South Africa in its case under the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice. And in response to that request, we also provide information to the government of South Africa relevant to that case. To date, over 6,000 pieces of information. And we will continue to cooperate with judicial processes for accountability in accordance with the responsibility given us by the Human Rights Council. We're very conscious of the importance of that cooperation. For the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, it supplements his own investigative efforts. For the International Court of Justice, it's perhaps even more important because that court does not have its own investigative arm in the way that the International Criminal Court does. It relies on parties or others, including the United Nations, to provide the evidence on which the court can base its decisions. So in providing evidence to the government of South Africa in relation to its case, we are assisting the court to determine the matter before it. We were particularly pleased that in the advisory opinion on the occupation, the International Court of Justice relied heavily on our own investigations and the conclusions in our reports. The court quoted us extensively and repeatedly. That made us feel even more responsible. We realised the extent to which what we were doing with our investigative work was directly related to accountability. It wasn't just a matter of informing you, member states, or getting a story in the media. It was enabling the court to make judicial decisions, authoritative decisions, on some of the most important issues concerning this situation. We were always very conscious of our accountability function, but certainly became even more so after we saw the extent to which the International Court of Justice is relying on us. So we'll continue that. And our intensive investigative work will continue to be one of the focuses, one of the primary focuses of our activities. Largely as a result of that, we have not yet dealt directly with the question of genocide. We are, I must note immediately, enormously grateful to Francesca for the extensive work that she has done on this subject. I don't think there has been more important work on the question of genocide in Palestine done by any other part of the United Nations system than the work that Francesca has done. And I certainly, as a Commissioner on the COI, want to thank her and acknowledge her enormous contribution. We are continuing to build brick by brick our understanding of the issue of genocide. And as we conduct our investigations, we are required to look generally at what we find by way of fact means in terms of law. So, to take an example from our most recent report, when we looked at the question of the destruction, the concerted attempt to destroy the healthcare system in Gaza, and looked at the attacks on reproductive healthcare and on children, particularly neonatal wards, we came to the conclusion that these attacks caused immediate physical and mental harm and suffering to women and girls, and will have irreversible long-term effects on the mental health and physical and reproductive fertility prospects of the Palestinian people as a group. Now, we're aware of the fact that that is one of the 5 categories of act under the Genocide Convention. We're aware of the fact that another category relates to the destruction of the conditions of sustainable life. And our work on healthcare, on housing, and coming up next year on education will be very much looking at the capacity of Palestinian people to sustain life under the circumstances that they have had to endure. So brick by brick, we are looking at this situation, and we will put all the pieces together and present our views. But in the meantime, we are very grateful for the work that Francesca has done. There are 2 particular issues I want to emphasise, however, in relation, Ambassador, to your theme of preventing genocide. There are aspects of the Genocide Convention that give rise to immediate obligations and criminal liability, whether or not genocide has occurred or is occurring. It is not necessary to wait for the International Court of Justice to decide the basic question of whether this constitutes genocide before these provisions come into effect. The first is the obligation on all state parties to the Convention to prevent genocide. Whether it is occurring or not, there is an obligation to prevent. And the work that we have done already, and even more, the work that Francesca has done in her reports, clearly activates the obligation to take action to prevent genocide. That obligation is not postponable. The second provision of immediate effect is the prohibition on incitement to genocide, and the fact that incitement is in itself a criminal offence. The incitement need not lead to genocide, And so you can have this criminal offence whether or not genocide is actually committed or occurs. Now, we have listed in our reports, we have quoted statements made by senior political and military leaders in the State of Israel that clearly constitute incitement to genocide. Now, whether or not the Israeli military forces, the Israeli government, is acting on that incitement is a separate, distinguishable and irrelevant question to the criminal offence of incitement to genocide. And there is no reason whatsoever why the International Criminal Court and national courts exercising universal jurisdiction should not be dealing now with the criminal offence of incitement to genocide. And of course, that also contributes to the issue of prevention. I look back at the work that we've done over the last 3 years, and I can point to achievements which make me feel good. The fact that the International Court of Justice has essentially relied on our investigative work. The fact that you, the members of the General Assembly, made the reference when we recommended the reference, and so forth. But this is not a matter on which we pat ourselves on the back. We have to say, at the same time, we have not stopped one child being killed. We have not stopped one woman being killed. We have not stopped the war. And you need to say the same things about the work of the General Assembly and the Security Council. I've been told, rightly, that members of the Security Council are pleased they've passed 4 resolutions since the 7th of October. But they have not stopped a single person being killed. So I don't want you to clap me when you're finished. It was Francesca, Feda, Tlaleng deserve to be clapped. But you clap me when the killing stops and not before, please.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sidoti, for your insightful and enlightening briefing. We appreciate your very important investigative role you are playing and the cooperation you are bringing to the judicial bodies. And thank you also for responding very clearly to the questions raised at the start of this meeting. I'm going now to give the floor to our next briefer, Mrs. Diana Buttu, who will be giving her presentation through video conference. Mrs. Buttu is a member of the Board of Commissioners of the Independent Commission for Human Rights of Palestine. And she's a Palestinian lawyer from Ramallah. She previously worked as a legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization and was a member of the team that worked on raising the legality of the separation wall before the International Court of Justice. Mrs. Buttu, I have the pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I first want to begin by thanking you for this opportunity to speak. And I, in particular, want to thank Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, occupied since 1967, who, despite almost daily attacks by those who are carrying out, supporting, and cheerleading this genocide, continues to stand strong and continues to present an objective legal analysis of the systemic destruction of Palestine and the ongoing genocide against Palestinians. History is going to look well upon you, Francesca. It will not for your accusers. Today we are witnessing the 390th, I can't believe that, the 390th day of Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. This is a genocide that has been live streamed before our very eyes. We, for 390 days, have watched mangled Palestinian bodies being removed from rubble. We've seen building after building being flattened by Israeli bombs. We've seen Israel attack hospitals, attack schools, attack universities, attack libraries, attack archives, attack ambulances, killing over 43,000 Palestinians, including doctors, nurses, paramedics, writers, professors, educators, journalists, and aid workers, including 237 UN staff who nobody seems to care about these days. No place is safe. No one is safe. Gaza is now a killing field. Over the past 390 days, we've seen that there are more than 13,000 children who've been killed by Israeli bombs. The largest Palestinian city, that of Gaza City, has been nearly reduced to rubble. And it's estimated that it'll take more than 18 years just to remove that rubble from Gaza. And in the midst of this, one can only imagine the unknown damage to the environment and to the Palestinian food supply after sustaining such a long bombing campaign. In the north, Israel's carrying out an extensive ethnic cleansing campaign promoted by Israel's generals. The options for Palestinians there are to starve, be killed, or flee. And all of this is happening before our eyes. And it bears repeating time and time again that nothing, absolutely nothing, justifies genocide. And while Israel and its supporters may try to discount claims of genocide, in fact, that's what all genocidal regimes do, the reality is seen and known. It's just being ignored. And as Palestinians, we refuse to be erased. You know, for those who don't know or who've never been, Gaza is about the size of Detroit. But unlike Detroit's 650,000 residents, Gaza has 2.1 million Palestinians living in it. It's among the most densely populated places in the world. And over the past 390 days, we've seen that almost 10% of Gaza's population has either been killed, has been injured, or is missing. In the US context of 330 million, that's the equivalent of 33 million people. And over the course of the past 390 days, Israel has issued evacuation orders over and over again to Palestinians, forcing them to flee from one area to another. It's been estimated that more than 80% of the Strip has been subjected to some type of misnomer evacuation order because they're not actually evacuating. They're just telling people to flee. They're not setting up shelter. They're not setting up hospitals. They're not setting up schools. They're just telling people to flee. And imagine if you can't. And many Palestinians have fled more than once. They've been fleeing time and again, with Israel treating Palestinians as though they're human pinballs, without any place for safety or without any security. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there is a context to this genocide, that of military occupation. And it's the occupier's duty, as well as that of third states, to protect Palestinians. It's important to keep in mind that the situation that Palestinians were facing, particularly those in Gaza, was that of an illegal siege and blockade that was slowly killing Gaza. As the International Court of Justice noted in its most recent advisory opinion on Palestine, it said, quote, "The court considers that the violations by Israel of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force and of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination have a direct impact on the legality of the continued presence of Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful." The court, of course, then adds that this relates not only to the West Bank, but to the entirety of the territory that Israel has occupied in 1967. And it calls upon member states to do something to actually end this situation. And it concludes by saying that the entirety of occupied Palestinian territory, it should be able to exercise, Palestinian people should be able to exercise the right to self-determination, and its integrity must be respected. Now here it's important to know that here the court was dealing with Israel's occupation. genocide. As we all know, the international community has a moral and legal imperative to act. This is the bedrock of the international human rights system as we know it. It's enshrined in the Genocide Convention, and it's binding on all states. And for me as a Palestinian lawyer, I thought that never again actually meant never again. And the reason I thought this is because the rules of international law spell this out. But instead, we're seeing that never again really means never again for some only. The response by the international community has neither been adequate nor has it been uniform. And while we are aware and thankful for the individual country efforts to address this genocide and to hold Israel to account, we're now in a world where we see the axis of genocide, that of Israel, the United States, and some European states, either pushing for a continuation of the genocide, supporting it, or funding it. The failure to speak in one voice that says loudly that occupation, land theft, colonization, ethnic cleansing, and genocide is unacceptable, is what has led us to this place where we are today, where 390 days into a genocide, the world is still not acting in one voice. This comes despite the International Court of Justice's order that there's a plausible reason for genocide. And we continue to see that some governments continue to support Israel with weapons, while others are disrupting aid to the trapped Gazan population. These actions amount to an abrogation of their duty to prevent genocide, both under international law and within their own national jurisdictions. This complicity has come in many forms through the provision of weapons, through financial support, and through diplomatic cover that has shielded perpetrators from accountability. And all of this must stop. Far from preventing further deaths in Gaza, Israel's bombardments since the ICJ order in January of 2024 have killed a further 18,000 Palestinians. Amnesty International has said that Israel's failed to even take the bare minimum steps to comply with the ICJ ruling, and others have made the same point. The strength of any legal system can be measured by how well it protects its weakest elements, not by how it shields its perpetrators. And here we see that Israel has been able to get away with perpetrating genocide against a stateless, defenseless refugee population. We also see that Israel is intensifying its attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, with over 700 Palestinians killed in the West Bank by Israeli soldiers and settlers in the past year. Israel continues to defy international law. It continues to defy the UN. It comes as no surprise given that a former Israeli ambassador said that, quote, the UN building should be closed and should be wiped off the face of the earth, unquote. As I conclude my remarks, I want to highlight one final point, particularly as somebody who lives here, who lives in the West Bank, and who's witnessing this genocide take place less than 150 kilometers from my home. For over a year, we've watched Israeli soldiers record and upload evidence of their crimes to TikTok and to other social media. We've seen them blow up universities and schools while giggling and lighting cigarettes. We've seen them dedicate the blowing up of schools to their children. We've seen that save the date wedding invitations written on destroyed homes of Palestinians. We've seen Israeli tank drivers filming themselves as they crush Palestinians. We've heard of tank drivers talk about the endless homes that they flatten. We've seen the endless videos of Israeli soldiers stripping, blindfolding, beating, and torturing Palestinians. We've also seen videos of Israelis use Palestinians as human shields, and other videos of Israelis rioting, literally rioting, for the right to rape Palestinians, the thousands of Palestinians who are held hostage in Israeli jails. We actually don't know how many there are at this point. Now, these soldiers appear without masks, with their name known, because in part it is now cool to show how tough you are with Palestinians. No one has been prosecuted for these crimes. These soldiers are effectively challenging the international community and saying to you, I will do whatever I want. I will forever be immune. And what I want to say to you is this: are they right? Because imagine what it is like to live in a society where this is considered to be okay. Just imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Buttu. We all knew that the violations of the occupying power in the OPT were real, were shocking, but your briefing, based on undeniable facts taken from the ground, adds depth and credibility to the reality of these very grave criminal violations. Thank you, Mrs. Buttu, for your briefing, and we thank also the members of your organization, and keep up the good work. Now, let me turn to our last but not least briefer, who is Mrs. Anisha Patel, Governing Council Member and Head of Content and Discourse Department at the NGO Law for Palestine. Mrs. Patel has worked with governmental and intergovernmental organizations related to the UNESCO World Heritage System, as well as the intersection of heritage and peace with the focus on community-based processes. Mrs. Patel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ambassador Abdelhady, the Special Rapporteurs, and the Commissioner, and Mrs. Buttu for your very, very articulate interventions. For almost 13 months now, we have witnessed the brutality of Israel's settler colonial genocidal assault against the Palestinian people in Gaza. But this is only the most violent manifestation of the ongoing 76-year-long Nakba and the apartheid that has been inflicted upon the entirety of the Palestinian people across the geography and in the diaspora, who are not allowed to return. For those of us who have followed this genocidal onslaught on our screens for the past 13 months, we're all too familiar with the haunting pleas from Palestinian journalists who are being brutally targeted as we speak for broadcasting their own destruction in real time. The first 11 pages of the 649-page list of identified matters released by the Health Ministry in September were names of Palestinian children who hadn't yet reached the age of 1. But you all already know this and more, because in line with the UNSC Resolution 2334, since January 2017, the Council and members have received monthly updates on the situation in Palestine. Member states have also been given ample documented evidence through the special procedures, the commissioners, the ICJ, who have all been establishing fact patterns and analyzing them legally. The Palestinians have been documenting this for over 76 years now. So lack of knowledge is really not the concern here. So I will not actually talk about, in this intervention, which is an urgent call to action to stop the genocide and end the settler colonial apartheid regime and occupation, upon an appeal to your morality by detailing the loss of Palestinian lives or Palestinians in arbitrary detention, of the extensively documented mass torture or forced displacement or continued starvation and famine. If that was a factor in consideration, we would not have had to witness Palestinian children being blown to smithereens by 2,000-pound bombs. We wouldn't still be here calling for a ceasefire 13 months later. Instead, what I want to do is outline the legal consequences and responsibilities for third states for failing to prevent and punish the crime of genocide that Israel is committing, the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the OPT, tantamount to aggression, its breach of Article 3 of CERD amounting to racial segregation and apartheid, its violation of peremptory norms, including the prohibition of acquisition of territory by force, and the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, all of which are legal findings of the International Court of Justice, which is the UN court, your court, findings that the Palestinian people, again, have been articulating for decades now. The ICJ's historic advisory opinion of 19 July rendered the occupation of the Palestinian territory unlawful. The Assembly resolution that followed in September demanded an end to this occupation within a year and called on states to comply with their obligations under international law. The court affirmed that the states have an obligation, not to recognize as legal this situation. including the violation of Article 3 of CERD, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation. And even though the ICJ advisory opinion is restricted to the 1967 borders because of the request from the General Assembly, understanding the systematic nature of apartheid and racial segregation means recognizing that it applies to the entirety of the Palestinian people as a whole, including the refugees that have been denied the right of return. The Commission of Inquiry's position paper on the ICJ advisory opinion, which has extensively detailed the obligations of states to act individually and collectively, including by building political, economic, and cultural pressure on the Israeli government to end this unlawful occupation. It also states that member states can be found complicit in the internationally wrongful acts because of aiding and abetting this process. So at this point, after all of these preliminary measures, orders from the ICJ and the advisory opinion, the most basic ask, 13 months in, not least because of the ongoing genocide, is a complete embargo on the boycotting, selling, and transfer of arms, munitions, and related equipment, as outlined in the UNGA resolution. It is not only an obligation that arises from the advisory opinion, but also from the duties of states to prevent and punish the crime of genocide, as outlined in the Convention and the preliminary measures orders in the South Africa versus Israel case. In Nicaragua versus Germany, the ICJ has also reminded member states that both the Genocide Convention, along with all the Geneva Conventions, reiterate this obligation of not to transfer arms to parties of an armed conflict, because otherwise states could be found complicit in this conflict, in this genocide. This restriction on arms also extends to military training, research, development cooperation with Israel that supports the unlawful occupation. And I would add racial segregation and apartheid across the territory. The ICJ, along with states parties that made interventions in the case, also emphasized on the prolonged nature of the occupation, longest in the post-World War II history. This prolonged nature of the occupation, along with the entrenched settler colonial apartheid regime, the infrastructure built around it, the annexation of vast territories, including through illegal settlements and colonies, and legislative changes that have taken place around this, mean that today, the possibility of making a distinction between Israel and its operations in the OPT is nearly impossible. The Commission of Inquiry in their position paper also critically identified this burden of proof of making this distinction now lies on Israel. Therefore, third states that are actually dealing with any of these entities in Israel have the obligation to make clear this distinction. Otherwise, they will be found complicit in this wrongful act. Beyond arms, this obligation of non-assistance also includes areas of economic, diplomatic, cultural, and academic relations. Third states are obliged to cease all financial, trade, investment, and economic relations with Israel that maintain or support the unlawful occupation and the apartheid. War economies are usually organized such that making this distinction between financial institutions that are located in Israel and not contributing to the unlawful presence of Israel in the OPT is nearly impossible. Therefore, banks, financial institutions, and other such institutions stand complicit in the maintenance of this unlawful situation, and third states therefore have a duty to not trade with them, to not be complicit in accordance with the ICJ orders. States are also obliged not to provide aid to academic, research, or cultural institutions that support the occupation. And here again, we draw on the extensive work done by Palestinian colleagues and academics for decades now that trace the direct connection between Israeli academia and the armed forces that operate in the OPT, making it impossible to, again, identify this distinction. Where does one stop and the other begin? All these obligations are not just incumbent on states for their own action, but also extend to all persons and corporations that are domiciled in the jurisdictions of states. Having adequate legislation at the national level to hold individuals and corporations that are engaged in rendering aid and assistance to the unlawful situation are therefore prerequisites for states to have in place now. At the same time, having legislation that respects the freedom of expression and assembly and does not criminalize support for Palestinian rights, something that the special rapporteurs have outlined in their statement a few weeks ago, including criminalizing Palestinian support for measures outlined by the ICJ, such as boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, is now in direct contravention to the advisory opinion. Finally, we have witnessed this for decades now, but especially over the last year, Israel has systematically infringed upon its duties towards the UN, violating protections afforded to UN bodies such as UNRWA and UNIFIL, reflected in the unprecedented number of UN staff members killed and the repeated assaults on UN facilities across the geography. The latest Israeli legislation banning UNRWA, as many of you have rightly pointed out, is absolutely outrageous. Other than being in direct contravention to the 3 ICJ preliminary measures orders, this action is also in violation of Article 5 of the UN, 105 of the UN Charter. Condemnation is not sufficient for this absolutely devastating impact that it will have on the Palestinian people. Furthermore, Israel's refusal to engage with UN mechanisms, not allowing visits from special rapporteurs and independent commissions of inquiries, attacking them, declaring the Secretary General persona non grata, flouting rules of the UNGA and multiple Security Council resolutions are all violations of Article 25 of the UN Charter. Therefore, in line with the Charter, member states, for the sake of maintaining international peace and security, must suspend Israel from the UN General Assembly. This is not an exceptional ask. This is not specific to one state or another. It has, in fact, been undertaken before for the apartheid regime in South Africa and several other states in different forums of the UN. Because we are at a critical juncture now, the stability, along with the legitimacy of this post-World War II international legal order is hanging by a thread, if it still exists. This is a direct result of decades of impunity extended to the State of Israel. We, as Palestinian civil society organizations, along with our allies, are working on bringing these legal obligations that I have discussed to all the mechanisms available to us internationally, but also, and importantly, nationally. Submitting communications to the ICC, to the special procedures, to the commissioners, and bringing national litigation as and where is necessary. The protests on the streets and the campuses and the docks and the weapon factories are visible manifestations of these efforts and a clear sign that this movement will only continue to grow until we reach liberation. The genocide on the ground continues unabated, the occupation worsens, and the apartheid is more entrenched than ever before. How member states that are sitting in this chamber today respond to their legal obligations that have come through all the legal work that has been done, including bringing an end to the occupation, the apartheid, dismantling the settlements and colonies, returning the land back to the Palestinians, allowing Palestinian refugees to return, will only determine the credibility of this institution and this multilateral system in general. And ensuring Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination, liberation, is the only way forward out of the situation we find ourselves in today. Thank you.
Mrs. Patel, I would like to say how much we appreciate the work you are doing on the ground, defending, promoting the rights of Palestinians, and also we appreciate a lot the collaboration we are having at the committee and the organization. We thank you for your very relevant briefing, focused mainly on third states' legal responsibilities. I think this is very important. So thank you so very much. We have now listened to all our distinguished panelists, whom I thank for their pertinent statements. Now, as it is the usual practice, I would like to open the floor for questions or statements by committee members and observers and other member states. I would encourage colleagues to make short interventions, and if they have questions, they can also raise those questions to our panelists. We shall gather a few questions before giving the floor to the speakers. So let's start, and please signal if you want to take the floor. I can see Cuba as the first speaker. Cuba, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Que
Whenever somebody who is used to covering the situation in Palestine is given the possibility of speaking, they start with a very long sigh before they actually start speaking. Now, that's a sigh which exposes pain, frustration, solidarity, but most of all, a great deal of love for the people of Palestine. Simultaneously, that long sigh, at least speaking personally here, also expresses real anger about those committing genocide and those who are complicit in the commission of that genocide. Today, we must not forget to mention the matter of complicity in the commission of genocide, because we believe it is critical to look at the root cause why it has spread so much, this genocide against the Palestinian people. We have at the United Nations heard on many occasions people mention that the state of Israel has the right, the legitimate right, to self-defense. Perhaps it would be enlightening if we asked ourselves, whenever we mention that the state of Israel has the right to defend herself, that we're not giving them a carte blanche to kill Palestinians. Let us go over very briefly what we have recently seen and what we've seen within the United Nations. The civilian population is being attacked indiscriminately. There has been the murder of more than 42,000 Palestinians, the majority of them women and children. 60% of them, according to UN Women. An entire people has been displaced. There has been murder of UN personnel. There has been murder of accredited journalists. There have been attacks against UNIFIL. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has been declared a persona non grata. There has been destruction before our very eyes of the UN Charter at the General Assembly, which is turning into a mere puppet or clown assembly. In Lebanon, we have seen the areas where our accredited embassies are in that country attacked. So where are we going to end up? What sort of world have we become? I think that it's high time for us to act without double standards or hypocrisy. And I would like to ask the panelists, whom I would like to thank for being here, what more we can do. But I think there's also the question of the ICJ. They have given us a roadmap already. They have clearly defined what complicity in genocide means. And they have shown us the next steps that need to be taken. Special procedures have also done this time and again, clearly, without leaving room to doubt. And so we are left wondering why we cannot make headway and halt this genocide. So, Chair, colleagues, if the Palestinians are still upright, resisting and struggling, surviving, we need to ensure that they are not left to fall. We can't leave them to die more. We need to stop this collective murder which is being carried out. We need to support them without hypocrisy, without double standards. We need to help them ensure that their country can be free and independent, as they deserve and as they have won for themselves. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Cuba. Let me indicate that on my list of speakers, I have Malta, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and Indonesia. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Malta.
Thank you, Chair. I also thank the two Special Rapporteurs, Commissioner Sidoti, as well as all the briefers for their very insightful briefings. Chair, as we have been consistently and repeatedly stating during our term on the Security Council, as well as in other international fora, the situation for Palestinian civilians throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is deplorable, tragic, and catastrophic. What is unfolding in North Gaza in particular is completely unacceptable and simply cannot go on. Malta has been unequivocal in its calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, for the unhindered humanitarian aid into and across the Strip. Furthermore, Malta reiterates its firm condemnation of the 7th October atrocities and continues to call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Here I would like to make a little aside and respond to the Commissioner, who I think was a bit unfair in saying that the Security Council has not saved one life yet, because we have actually worked very, very hard. And it's true that we have had 4 resolutions which haven't been entirely implemented, but the resolution penned by Malta in 2712, adopted last November, did lead the way to a negotiated agreement which saw a 7-day pause. And I believe that lives were saved in those days. We would have liked to have seen that pause continue and be a ceasefire. It is unfortunate that not all of the Council could agree to such a terminology. But if we have learned one thing in the last year of this war, is that the only way to resolve the issue was through a procedure like that and through diplomacy. Because since the implementation of Resolution 2712, after those 7-day pause, we have seen only death and more destruction, and the achievement of the declared Israeli goals of their war was definitely not achieved through the war, but it could have been achieved through implementation of such resolutions. So we have learned one thing for sure, that diplomacy here and dialogue is what is needed. And we will continue to use every platform that we have as Malta to ensure that we call for ceasefires and we use all our influence possible to force the parties to considering entering into the ceasefire and to saving as many lives as we can, because even as we speak here today, people are dying and we cannot continue seeing these atrocities any longer. Too little is being done to safeguard civilians. Women and children continue to suffer disproportionately, and it is something which is horrific to us all and is hurting all of us at the UN. Equitable accountability is needed across the board. We are deeply disturbed by the alarming conclusions of the report published by the OHCHR and the Commission of Inquiry. Justice and accountability, including through the ICC, is owed to all victims of the crimes committed through this conflict. We stress that respecting and implementing the findings of international judicial institutions, including the ICJ, is fundamental for the multilateral system. This is also key if we are to see the full realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people as a credible, irreversible realization of the two-state solution. And I stress irreversible, as we stress it constantly. We are now at a point where the two-state solution is the only solution that we have to focus on. Chair, before I conclude, it would be remiss of me not to mention the unprecedented situation currently faced by UNRWA, an agency that for decades has served as a stabilizing force in the region. Millions of Palestinian refugees depend on it, and it must be allowed to carry out the mandate given to it by the General Assembly. We therefore call on Israel to rescind the laws targeting the agency, which are contrary to international law. Thank you.
I thank my dear colleague of Malta. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Malaysia.
Thank you, Chair. I also wish to thank Ms. Francesca Albanese, Ms. Tlaleng, Mofokeng, Commissioner Chris Sidoti, Ms. Diana Buttu, and Ms. Anisha Patel for their briefings, and also their immensely important work and contribution. Malaysia agrees that we are at a critical juncture which would determine not only the future of Palestine, but also that of the rules-based international order that we have worked so hard to build since the last Great War. We also concur that it is extremely vital that member states stand in solidarity with Palestine, uphold international law, and make every effort to ensure the full implementation of all relevant UN resolutions, as well as the orders and opinions of the International Court of Justice to stop genocide in Palestine for the sake of humanity and our collective future. We're also well aware of the systematic smear campaign and wicked tactics perpetrated by Israel to undermine UN entities and mechanisms, including the Human Rights Council mechanisms of which some of our distinguished briefers are members. We salute their dedication and commitment in performing their responsibilities, which have become more important than ever before. Chair, in this regard, Malaysia urges all member states to continue illustrating their unequivocal solidarity and support for all UN entities and mechanisms that are working on Palestinian-related matters. It is also important for us to make every effort to ensure that all the entities and mechanisms on Palestinian-related issues are being protected and facilitated, as well as allocated with sufficient resources to carry out their important responsibilities. Thank you, Chair.
I thank my dear colleague of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Sri Lanka, who happens to be also the chair of the UN Committee on Israeli Practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Sheikh, for giving me the floor. The situation in Palestine and its people can be described very briefly, perhaps as a struggle for sovereignty and human rights amid enduring conflict and displacement, marked by daily resilience in the face of political and humanitarian catastrophe. I don't need to say more because the briefers have been very, very clear in what they said. The picture is very clear and perhaps very gloomy. So I thought I'd probably offer some encouragement to those of them who are working so relentlessly on this matter, who are investigating Israeli practices and human rights violations in Palestine, and to emphasize the importance of your work for achieving justice, accountability, and long-term peace. And in that endeavor, let me offer the encouragement in this way. We recognize that the committees and all those who are working together, their work is crucial for upholding international human rights and humanitarian law. That it reinforces that your work contributes to a broader system of global accountability and the protection of fundamental rights. Secondly, we must, colleagues, recognize the efforts to bring transparency to a complex and sensitive issue. Your investigations, their investigations shed light on actions that impact millions of lives and offer the international community credible insights to make informed decisions. Thirdly, we must remind ourselves that the work of everybody who is working on this is a contribution of the UN's historic mandate to promote peace, security, and justice, particularly in conflict regions such as Palestine. Then, that your efforts provide a voice for the many Palestinian civilians affected by the conflict. That accountability is essential for meaningful peace in the region, and your work serves as a step forward, holding all parties accountable for their actions. And we must publicly, I say, acknowledge and celebrate the dedication, the integrity, and the courage required to conduct these investigations. We today express gratitude for your commitment, especially given the challenge and sensitivities involved in investigating such issues. We also attach importance to your independence and impartiality in achieving legitimacy and credibility. I urge today all member states, organizations, and other stakeholders to cooperate fully with the works of the committees. Your collaboration, because their collaboration can help your collaboration can help the committees gather comprehensive evidence. And finally, we must assure the committee members that their findings will not be ignored, but lead to actionable steps by the international community. And finally, reaffirm commitment to providing necessary resources and the protection necessary for committee members and others working in this regard, ensuring that they have the support they need to conduct thorough and secure investigations in a challenging environment. So, my dear friends, encouraging everyone who's working on this so committedly will help maintain, I believe, the resolve and the effectiveness, ensuring their contribution to meaningfully ensuring justice, transparency, and their efforts will yield results in their efforts in Palestine. I thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank the briefers for their input. In the comfort of those rooms we are seated in, civilians are being killed by the minute. In Gaza, in the wider occupied Palestinian territories, women, children, elderly, persons with disabilities, by the minute. And yes, we haven't been able to collectively stop the war and save lives, but it is heartening to know that there are still individuals with the integrity and the human conscience to make the case. So your work is important. Important because you help the Palestinian people to build and to sustain the narrative of their just cause, to exercise and to fulfill their inalienable right to self-determination towards the establishment of their independent, contiguous state on the borders of 4 June 1967. In this connection, yes, it is a genocidal war of aggression. The war machinery is continuing, and it is only an episode in a very long, protracted series of a sustained and persistent violation of international law through the continued occupation of Palestinian land. And we here salute the resilience, the long-term resilience of the Palestinian people in the face of the atrocities that they have been facing and confronting throughout their existence. It is crime. It is a crime of genocide. It is not only systemic, it is individual and systemic. And yes, statements that have come out from leaders are dehumanizing Palestinians and paving the way for that genocide. And this has to stop. As Egypt, as a party concerned in that, in fighting for the Palestinian cause throughout our history, we are working towards the ceasefire, but also working towards the humanitarian assistance, the access, the unhindered, immediate access of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, especially now in Gaza. And we will continue to work on that in parallel. And we would like to voice our position in total rejection and objection to any attempts to discredit the integrity of reports and individuals and experts who have been voicing the concerns and raising our voices for the just cause of the Palestinian people in order for them not to be put into oblivion. So maybe the words are not enough, but they keep the cause alive and into the attention and in our eyes. Thank you.
I thank my dear colleague from Egypt for her intervention. The remaining member state on my speakers list is Indonesia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you also to the briefers for their very frank briefings. We are, of course, gravely horrified by the continued violent acts of Israel against the Palestinians that have been deprived of their basic rights under 57 years of illegal occupation. It must stop now. The imposition of conditions leading to imminent famine demonstrates Israel's intent to eliminate Palestinian populations, fulfilling the criteria of genocide under international conventions. Yet as we see, Israel is given a free pass to repeatedly violate international law, including their most recent move to adopt the two legislation that would force a halt to UNRWA's operations in violations of the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and relevant resolutions. On this note, my delegation would like to pose questions. In what ways the recent Israel bills to outlaw UNRWA have the potential to heighten the scale of genocide even further? And in what ways will the attack against UNRWA impact your duty, special reporters, as mandate holders? I thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Now I'm going to open the floor for non-state members who want to take the floor. And please signal and also identify yourselves when you start speaking. Press the button and then you can speak. I can see Uganda is requesting for the floor. No.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair of the committee, and thank you to the briefers, the special rapporteurs, for your very important briefing. We remain deeply concerned with the worsening situation unfolding in the occupied Palestinian territory. This continued loss of civilian lives, the humanitarian crisis, and destruction of property is deeply disturbing. We continue to monitor the humanitarian impact of the conflict on civilian populations. This demands our urgent attention, and we continue to call for humanitarian assistance to the affected people. We remain concerned that the recent developments risk impeding all efforts for a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question. We, all member states, must remain committed to upholding the Charter of the UN and international law. It's our common responsibility to ensure and protect the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to statehood. A human tragedy continues to unfold, and we must be vocal in driving actionable outcomes at the UN to respond to this prolonged historic injustice. We remain committed to this cause, and we continue to call on the international community and all actors to muster the courage and exert all efforts to pursue a just and comprehensive peace in Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda for his statement. Now, I have two requests from the floor. I have numbers. So the number of the seat is 1080. Please take the floor and identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm David Wildman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the NGO Working Group on Israel-Palestine, and it's a pleasure to be here today with this grim subject. But I just want to offer my thanks and expression on behalf of the NGO Working Group to the committee and also to all the panelists for really the important work you've been doing all year long, not just at this panel today. The question I'd like to ask for the panelists is, a number of years ago, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution around a database of looking at corporate complicity. And it seems to me that coming out of the resolution on the ICJ opinion from this past September, that I'd invite comments from the panelists about the need for the General Assembly to take up this database approach of naming those that are not in compliance with the provisions of the advisory opinion, corporations and other non-state actors, as well as member states. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. And once again, I would like to express our gratitude for the cooperation we are having with the committee. You are regularly invited in our events. So thank you so very much. Now I give the floor to the next speaker. You have the floor, sir. I can see you. You can have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the panelists. My name is Saleh Hijazi. I'm from the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement. And I would like the panel to comment on the complicity of other states, institutions, and corporations in Israel's ongoing and live-streamed genocide against 2.3 million people in Gaza and the entrenched apartheid against all Palestinians, including Palestinian refugees who are denied their right to return. Chair, Zionist settler colonialism would not have been able to come to this point of carrying out genocide if it was not for the complicity of states, institutions, and corporations. This complicity is reflected in recognizing as legitimate or normalizing an illegal situation and a crime. It is also by arming, funding, and trading and investing in this criminal situation. It is also shielding Israel from accountability. The Palestinian civil society is very clear on what should happen. This is not only in the interest of Palestinians and stopping genocide and ending apartheid, but for the sake of the multilateral system based on the rule of law. A military embargo must be imposed on Israel. Sanctions, trade sanctions, and ending diplomatic relations by states must be also carried out, and Israel must be suspended from the UN General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank you, sir, for your questions and statement. A number of questions have been asked, and a series of comments have been made. I'm going now to give the floor back to the briefers, and I will invite them to respond to the question they want to respond to and to make comments on the comments which have been made. And then, at the same token, also make the final comments for this session. Maybe I'll start by Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, and then I'll go to Special Rapporteur Mofokeng, and then Commissioner Sidoti. I don't know whether Buttu is available. She's available online. So then Buttu, and then we'll have Mrs. Anisha Patel. So, Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, delegates and other participants for your questions. I will address first the question from the representative of Cuba. What can you do? First of all, having a clear strategy of what is needed. I speak from a very clear standpoint, international law. And what international law obliges you to do is, if you really need to have a scheme, end the genocide. And the genocide is not a war. In order to have a war, I mean, look, I hear you speaking, and I respect you a lot, but something inside me shakes, because you're talking of this as if there were two armies confronting each other. If it's a war, if it's a conflict, it's between a people who are trying to resist on the little that remains of their land, frankly, and one of the most powerful armies here in the region. And again, I insist on the settler colonial framework. And I insist on this on the ground, that this is how we can read it from an international law point of view, because it's the most basic infringement of the law of self-determination. If you don't understand that this is a settler colonial conflict, then please don't call it a conflict. So, end the genocide. Now, this is it is to happen now. Then, within the framework, then the General Assembly has said so. Before September next year, end of the occupation, and then long-term end of apartheid. This is what it is to be done. And there are things that you can do. First of all member states, and together with other rapporteurs, I think it was 30 of us, but also the Commission of Inquiry, we have issued recommendations on how to comply with the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. So review all engagement that and ties that your states have with the State of Israel. And again, it's nothing against the State of Israel per se, it's the State of Israel as a persistent violator of international law. And then arms embargo and other forms of transfers, including oil, have to be suspended. And again, while I look at the West, and I'm very critical of the part of the world I come from, many states from the global south still have ties with Israel. And again, we need to have clean hands on this at the moment that genocide is being committed. So these relations have to be suspended. Review political, economic, diplomatic, military, and strategic relations with Israel. Because let's be frank, many states are looking at Israel with a bit of admiration in the way it manages to win over through its gain impunity, go ahead with its impunity. I mean, the way Israel is genocided the Palestinian population is also setting a new model, presenting a new script on how to deal with people who are considered an encumbrance and can be Palestinian, Lebanese, but in another setting, in another country, can be political opponents. This represents a risk for all of us, for all of you. And then accountability. I look at Arab countries as a source of hope. Much more can be done to advance accountability. Join the proceedings initiated by South Africa. Please, please. And advance, and also those of you who are party to the Rome Statute, please, please initiate, contribute to the investigation that is being done. This is very powerful and symbolic on top of being technically needed. Another element that is very important, the Palestinians who have been displaced from Gaza are highly traumatized. I've seen it with my own eyes, those who have been welcomed in Qatar, in other Arab countries, in Jordan, those who are in Egypt. They need protection. Protection needs. I thank all of you who have welcomed them, but having them just parked there is not enough. They need protection. And as someone who has studied the status and treatment of Palestinians, including in Arab countries, I beg you, please don't treat them as unwelcome guests. They need to be protected now more than ever. And this doesn't require, I'm not talking only to Egypt, Qatar, and Jordan. I'm talking to Arab countries. This is a time to show true solidarity to the Palestinians at the time they're being genocided. Justice also means recognizing the value. I'm so happy to see the BDS movement present here today. I think it's the first time that the BDS is participating in activities of the General Assembly, and this is a sign of how times are changing and changing fast. A number of countries have even criminalized the BDS that in other countries like in South Africa has been strategic in advancing the end of apartheid. More needs to be done, including in Arab countries, to support the BDS, and including in discussing with countries, members of this assembly, which criminalize the BDS. Indonesia asked how the assault on UNRWA and the nail in the coffin was the outlawing the organization through an act of the Israeli parliament, how does it affect, if it can also be seen as part of the genocidal assault on the Palestinian? I think it is, in two respects, and one is very clear. UNRWA does represent a lifeline for the Palestinians in Gaza, not only for what it does and provides, which might be very little compared to the needs, but what it can provide. UNRWA has the capacity to assist the Palestinians in a way that no other agency can. And so the fact of incapacitating UNRWA is going to have a clear, serious humanitarian impact on the already tragic humanitarian situation in Gaza. But also, while cultural genocide is not an element of the crime, jurisprudence is clear that attacking the identity, the sense of life, the sense of collective identity of a people can contribute to identify genocidal intent. And this is what I think is behind the assault on UNRWA that didn't start on October 7. It has been decades of vilification and threats against the agency that now, of course, have escalated. And with this, I end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. Now I go to Special Rapporteur Tlaleng Mofokeng for her final comments. Precede it, if you want, by responding to questions and comments made by
Thank you, Chair. I just want to reiterate that what is required at the moment is the protection, the promotion of human rights of the Palestinians, and that human rights continue to be a guiding compass and a solution-orientated framework that we should all be behind. And that, in fact, what is required right now is not more practices of benevolence or in kindness, but we need to understand that these are real issues of human rights, of life and death. And from a right to health perspective, Palestinians are entitled to a system of health protection. That means quality health care, but also underlying determinants of health that provide them an equal opportunity for them to enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. And at the moment, they do not have that enjoyment and that right. And in the general comment number 14, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights reiterates that states are obliged to respect the right to health by inter alia refraining from denying or limiting equal access for all persons, including prisoners or detainees, to preventative, curative, and palliative health services. And in particular, it states that member states should refrain from limiting access to health services as punitive measure during armed conflict, as well as, of course, as we have now concluded that a genocide is happening to the Palestinian people. And these are immediate obligations, and they include the guarantee of non-discrimination and equal treatment, as well as the obligation to take deliberate, concrete, and targeted steps towards the full realization of the right to health. And all member states have a legal obligation to comply with the ICJ ruling. And therefore it's important, perhaps in a different angle from a right to health, but to also investigate and prosecute those subjects to their jurisdiction who are involved in crimes in the occupied Palestinian territory, including those with dual citizenship who are serving in the Israel military, including mercenaries, and those who are involved in settler violence. And that we do indeed need an immediate ceasefire. We need an end to the illegal occupation and an end to the genocide. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur Mofokeng, and I give the floor to Commissioner Sidoti.
Thanks, Ambassador. Three very brief comments. First, the representative of Malta has had to go, but I do want to thank her for her intervention and correcting me and reminding me of that Security Council decision on the short pause last year. She's absolutely right. And it's good to be corrected because that short pause gives me hope. and indicates that, in fact, something is possible when I feel that nothing is possible. So I'm very pleased to be corrected. Secondly, on UNRWA, I agree with what has been said, but I just want to make one very brief point on UNRWA. UNRWA has been very diligent in responding to allegations that have been made. There have been investigations. There was action taken in relation to 9 out of in excess of 13,000 staff. When the Israeli Defence Force acts as seriously as UNRWA does in dealing with investigations, then I might take the allegations of the Israeli government more seriously. Third, complicity. The representative of Cuba, the ambassador, has raised this question, so did David, so did Saleh. The issue of complicity has become crystal clear during the course of the last year as a result of the applications for arrest warrants by the prosecutor of the ICC, the provisional measures orders by the International Court of Justice, and the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. If there was doubt, there is no longer any doubt. With the reports that the Special Rapporteur has produced, other rapporteurs have produced, our Commission of Inquiry has produced, no one can say now, we did not know. You know, no one can hide behind accidental or willful ignorance. And with the actions taken by the courts, no one can say we don't know what the law is. Aiding or assisting the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, the crimes in the Rome Statute, is a criminal offence in itself. And it's not possible to pretend that we don't know. In fact, the onus has now shifted to those that are involved in any way in relations with the State of Israel. The onus has shifted onto them to examine those relationships and ask the question, is this in any way aiding and assisting the maintenance of the unlawful occupation, the continuation of the unlawful settlements, the displacement of Palestinian people from their land and property? There is an obligation to consider those questions and to prevent action, not only not to take action, but to prevent action if those questions are answered, yes, there is. Yes, this is supporting directly or indirectly the occupation and the settlements. So the facts are now clear, the law is now clear, the legal obligations are now clear, and we are entitled to expect that this be taken seriously and those who act contrary to law are held accountable. Saleh referred to the database of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That's an important contribution to this. But the High Commissioner has not had the resources to make it as extensive and updated as it should be. I know, again, I'm not whinging, complaining about our resources, but they're appalling. But the High Commissioner can make a great contribution to this question of complicity at the moment and is unable to do so. So perhaps the bottom line message is that if you expect the High Commissioner or us or the rapporteurs to do more, or even to do adequately what we're currently expected to do, you've got to enable us to do it. Give us what we need to be able to do it. But this question is now, with complicity, clear-cut, and that database becomes even more important.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Chris Sidoti. I now give the floor to Commissioner Diana Buttu.
Thank you very much. You know, when you study international law, one of the things that you learn, in fact, the mainstay of international law is studying about genocide. And the reason that we study genocide is because it becomes the test of the will of the international community. And so in studying international law and in studying genocide, you begin to see the patterns that are engaged, that are used in order to carry out a genocide. And those patterns, all of these distinguished speakers have spoken about it and written about it, but the patterns are so clear when it comes to what Israel is doing today. And despite the fact that we have all of this knowledge, and indeed there is a great deal of knowledge, this is probably the most over-reported place in the world, there's still an unwillingness to act. And that unwillingness to act leads me to believe that we have to form a coalition that is going to go against the axis of genocide. And I think that that's actually possible. But instead, what we've seen is that because the United States and because Israel are on one side, and nobody or very few are willing to challenge the United States or Israel, that we end up seeing many, many countries that are somehow sitting on the fence, using terminology that's incorrect, such as war, conflict, those sorts of things, instead of taking the actions that are necessary. And anybody who knows anything about genocide knows that the number one duty is to prevent genocide and then to stop it when it's in place. And so it's incumbent upon the members in this room, both as member states as well as us as individuals, both individually and collectively, to do absolutely everything that is necessary to stop this genocide and to stop Israel from continuing to perpetrate its crimes, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and against the Palestinian people as a whole. And so Francesca has given some amazing interventions about ideas. Chris has done the same. I'm not going to add to any of those, and certainly Salah and David have also given us some tools. But what I do want to say is that it's time that we begin to speak as one voice, because they're definitely speaking as one voice. And it's time for those who oppose genocide, who believe in preventing genocide and stopping genocide, to speak in one voice, to counter that axis of genocide. And I want to end by saying that, since the establishment of the State of Israel, the only way that it could have been established was through the dehumanization, the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinian people. I mean, when you think about it, who can live on another's land? Who can live literally inside the home of another person, using their cutlery, their dishes, sleeping on their bed, unless you've so dehumanized them to the point where you don't see them any longer? And so it's incumbent upon us to get to the point where we're no longer dehumanizing Palestinians, forcing Palestinians to constantly be putting their genocide on display. Instead, it's incumbent upon us to continue to act, to do whatever is possible with all of the suggestions that have been given, because I refuse to live in a world where Israel's considered above the law and where Palestinians are considered to be beneath the law. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Diana Buttu. I now give the floor to Mrs. Anisha Patel.
Thank you, Chair. All the esteemed speakers before me have outlined all the tools that we have already with us. And I think after 76 years of relentless atrocities that have been inflicted on the Palestinian people and documented and analyzed legally, socially, in all other aspects, I think the only call is to bring this to an end. Accountability towards states, corporations, individuals, institutions is now a legally binding obligation on everybody present here. And it's not just on, and I also want to specifically echo what Commissioner Sidoti said. Let everybody who is doing their jobs do their jobs, including civil society. Repression for following international law norms and outcomes that this General Assembly or this group of states, this UN institutions have created is unacceptable, not just for the sake of Palestinian people and for ensuring their exercise of their inalienable rights to self-determination, but for the legitimacy of this institution. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mrs. Anisha Patel. We have come to the end of this event. I would like first of all to thank most warmly our panelists. Nicaragua, am I going to give you the floor? You have to beg. Okay, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, distinguished chair. I didn't hear your last work as I was preparing my remarks. Chair. Representative of Palestine, first of all, I'd like to express the fact that I have always supported and will always support Palestine. We reiterate our love and our commitment to fight in this constant historical struggle which is Palestine's for its national liberation. We thank the two special rapporteurs and the Commissioner and Ms. Buttu and Ms. Patel very deeply from the bottom of my heart. And I'd like to thank colleagues, representatives of states and the various organizations who have spoken alike. We share the same feeling and opinion on this matter, but the most important of all is that I have noted, as Cuba did when their representatives started to speak, that we all share the pain being borne by the people of Palestine, and not just in this room. We've all witnessed how all of humankind actually is sharing not just this pain, but also solidarity with Palestine. All of you have, quite rightly, pointed to the specifics of the current tragedy. But what we would like to emphasize is what Ms. Patel and Cuba said, and various panelists too. Before, though, we should recall that we must never forget, and Ms. Buttu spoke about this earlier, we must never forget the vital responsibility of the United Nations throughout this tragedy and pain to support the people of Palestine. When the UN took the decisions it took, and that can never be forgotten, there is a responsibility incumbent upon the UN to find a solution so that this cannot continue as it has been happening. If we've seen so much suffering, repression, and genocide, which we can now see all over the world, we want to highlight two things. We fully agree with Ms. Patel. It's not enough to just condemn this reality and this suffering. Actions are needed now more than ever. In addition, there was discussion about complicity. Ms. Patel mentioned this. Others too, quite rightly pointing to the advisory opinion of the ICJ. And we wish to stress that above and beyond complicity, the essential thing here is to put an end to the policy of double standards. The Palestinian tragedy compels us to put these policies to one side forever. In all multilateral organizations. And we say that because we are seeing it. If you take any organization where this situation is presented. For instance, where do we see double standards? We see it when some states agree or even are obliged to engage in a ceasefire, but they continue to arm Israel. They continue with political, economic, and military support to Israel. Some states have also said that they support the two-state solution, but they do not recognize Palestine as a state. They only recognize one state. And they say they support the two-state solution. We also know quite well why the Security Council has been totally incapable of using the mechanisms it has at its disposal under the Charter to put an end to this genocide. But we do have to point to something, which is that things are changing. We share the frustration that there is within the UN that what is being done, what needs to be done is not being done to halt this genocide. But there is a change in the air, I've noticed. The General Assembly is speaking out with greater strength and support every day, recalling the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, demanding that justice be served for the people of Palestine. And we see this, given that Palestine is in the room in the General Assembly and for all meetings, we are taking steps in the right direction. The European Union can no longer continue with this complicity denying the Palestinian people their rights. They must recognize Palestine as a state. We are quite sure that the more states recognize Palestine, it will become ever more difficult to violate the rights of the Palestinian people. I'm sorry for speaking at some length, but I must express our ongoing solidarity with Palestine. This is a national liberation struggle, of course. We are convinced that Palestine will be free. This is something that applies to people across the world, even in the United States. And with Europe, well, we've seen these double standards, those who claim to defend freedom of expression, but in their own country, they're arresting Palestinians or any citizens expressing their solidarity with the people of Palestine. These double standards must end. They're losing credibility, all of these people supporting Israel and standing behind them no matter what they say. It's also absolutely critical to point to the Security Council. The Security Council will be able to stop this only with great difficulty. And so action in that connection is important. We have the International Court of Justice. Nicaragua has turned to that court on a number of occasions, and we thank the court for all of its rulings on Palestine. Complicity has to stop. But what do states have to do? It's fundamental to stop the shipment of arms to Israel. This is something European states can do. Apologies, Chair, but we just needed to share that that's also a priority. The ceasefire is required, but we need to demand that there are no more shipments of arms to Israel.
I thank my dear friend and colleague from Nicaragua. I can see that there is another request from the floor. Seat number 1085. Identify yourself and be brief, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. I would like, on behalf of my delegation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to thank you and the Committee of Palestinian Inalienable Rights for convening this briefing meeting, and I would also like to thank distinguished speakers and briefers for their insightful and comprehensive remarks. As a country that has always, since the illegal occupation of Palestine by a racist and apartheid regime began many decades ago, expressed its objection and condemnation of the colonial and extremist genocide and apartheid policies that have been taken against the Palestinians, the Islamic Republic of Iran once again unequivocally condemns the war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Israeli regime in occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. Chair, my delegation is of the opinion that among all the important and critical points shared by esteemed speakers and panelists are those which we should seriously consider not only as members of the international community, but also as humanity. Terminating relations, supporting judicial cases against the occupation and genocide, reconsider Israel's presence in different United Nations bodies, taking into account activities they have done in contrary to conditions by which their delegation's membership at the United Nations was accepted, and other necessary actions that have mentioned in this meeting must seriously keep into consideration. All we heard today regarding the violating human rights of Palestinians and mass crimes and brutality against civilians in Gaza and other territories under the aggression of Israel in our region, which embody not only war crimes and acts of genocide, but also a gross disregard for peremptory norms of international law and human decency, have a clear and meaningful message for the United Nations. This message contains nothing but that the biggest and most dreadful violation of human rights has been committed and is continued to be committed by Israel in West Asia. So there is nothing else more important and crucial for all human rights UN mechanisms to address. Especially while currently the entire system of the United Nations, including its charter and its staff immunity, is facing systematic defiance and ignorance by Israeli regime. Accordingly, we believe that the systematic attacks on UNRWA, which has stood with Palestinian refugees for decades, are part of a broader effort to dismantle Palestinian hope and erase their cause, as well as undermining the role of the United Nations. This was my question that I wanted to ask distinguished panelists, that considering all several international resolutions, conventions, pacts, and covenants that exist to protect human rights, which practical and necessary steps should be prioritized in the United Nations agenda and must be taken by the member states of the United Nations to stop these human rights violations against the people of Palestine, Lebanon, and other occupied territories in West Asia. However, I've already got the answer in final remarks and comments kindly expressed by panelists. So I don't want to take more time in this regard. Just to conclude, Mr. Chair, I just want to thank you and your colleagues again, and while commending your efforts in seeking the realization of Palestinian rights, including their inalienable right to self-determination and a full-fledged membership at the United Nations, assure you and other esteemed panelists of my delegation's support in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iran for his statement and for his question, but I have to indicate that the question was already addressed by the panelists, unless they want to add something to what they said previously, but I think it has been addressed. Thank you very much for your encouragements to the committee, and we really appreciate also your support and your commitment to the work of this committee. We thank you. Now we have come to the end of our event. I would like to thank most warmly our panelists. I think their accounts have been enlightening and have once again highlighted the urgent need to immediately, first of all, stop the current war in Gaza, and also to address the issue of accountability for the crimes perpetrated against Palestinians, and also to finally put an end to the occupation. I would like to thank our colleagues. I have seen here many of our colleagues from member states and many ambassadors here. I really appreciate their presence here. The mere fact of being here is a true testimony of the commitment and the support of this cause. And we also thank those who have taken the floor to make comments, ask questions. We also thank non-member states who have taken the floor to ask questions and show their support. And we also thank all those who have been following us on UN Web TV. Events like these, I think, play an essential role in exposing the staggering level of suffering affecting Palestinians. Our discussion reminds us that we, as the international community, civil society, and individuals alike, we must collectively be relentless in continuing to advocate for a just and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine. I know that there are so many things to be achieved. We seem to be slow in enacting, but the mere fact of having that discussion, this kind of discussion, I think will help us keep the story alive and continue to promote the rights of the Palestinians. This will only stop talking when we come to the end of the Israeli occupation that began in 1967, and this only will be stopping when we will witness one day, and wish that the day happens as soon as possible, the realization of the self-determination and independence of the Palestinian people. The world cannot fail the Palestinians in their legitimate aspirations for freedom. But before closing, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Ambassador Feda Abdelhady Nasser from the State of Palestine for her few final comments, if she wants to do so. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone for your moving presentations, to all of our briefers, and to all of the delegations and civil society representatives here for your compelling calls for action, for accountability, and for your solidarity with the Palestinian people in the face of decades of injustice and crimes that shame and haunt us all. But today we've heard not only unprecedented calls for accountability, but we are seeing growing efforts by governments, by UN bodies, by civil society, and by millions of people around the world standing against this inhumanity and seeking to act together to end this historic injustice. And the coalition that was mentioned by Diana, that must be strengthened. Our efforts must converge with immediate, tangible, legal, and political actions to end Israel's wanton violations of international law and crimes against the Palestinian people, and to assist them to realize their rights, including to return and to self-determination, and to realize the justice and freedom they have long been struggling for. And so, Mr. Chair, I wish to close with an expression of gratitude for the empathy, the solidarity, and the support extended to the Palestinian people, but also an appeal for that empathy and solidarity and support to carry on. Do not, please, do not forsake the Palestinian people. Do not take for granted their resilience on the front lines of this epic assault on humanity and the international legal order in its entirety. Do not succumb to the intimidation, to the incitement, to the reckless allegations of anti-Semitism. Do not accept the mocking and disrespect of your countries, your principles, our multilateral system, and our global family. Do not allow Israel to destroy the international system painstakingly established nearly 80 years ago. Do not become numb to the inhumanity, to the impunity. Do not normalize the depravity, the killing of babies, children, women, and men. Do not normalize genocide. Stop arming, stop funding, stop supporting this genocide and illegal occupation. Stop the complicity and double standards. Stop justifying this genocide, which nothing can justify. Not October 7th, nothing. Please continue to act with all the legitimate tools we have to insist on right over might, to protect and provide sustenance to the Palestinian people, including by protecting and sustaining UNRWA, to bring an end to this nightmare our people have suffered for too long, to end this Nakba, to end this illegal occupation and apartheid regime, to liberate them from decades of oppression and persecution, to uphold the promise of international law and our collective humanity for the Palestinian people, but also for the future of all peoples in every corner of the world. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Feda Abdel Nasser, for your very strong and moving remarks. We heard you. As per usual practice, the chair summary of this briefing will be posted on the website of the committee at www.unespal.un.org. The video recording of this event will be also available on UN Web TV and on the committee's YouTube channel. Let me remind you that you can also follow the committee on our website at unespal.un.org, on X, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can also join our mailing list to receive the committee newsletters and to stay up to date with the committee's activities. For your information, as part of its efforts to contribute towards a just, comprehensive, and lasting settlement of the question of Palestine, the committee will observe the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on Tuesday, the 26th of November, 2024. The special commemorative meeting of the committee will be held in person at this room, at the ECOSOC chamber, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Observances will also take place at the UN offices at Geneva, Nairobi, and Vienna. We look forward to your ongoing engagement and to welcome you in our future activities. Once again, a warm, warm, warm thank you to our panelists, and we thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.